So, like, in my personal headcanon, the child in this story is like every annoying, precocious British child from a Netflix drama. It's like, oh, how perfectly splendid. But, Mummy, must you and Daddy go away to Germany in 1939 on your road trip? But yeah, you'll see what I mean. How the first letter was written. Once upon a most early time was a Neolithic man. He was not a Jute or an Angle or even a Dravidian, which he might well have been, best beloved, but never mind why. He was a primitive, and he lived cavily in a cave, and he wore very few clothes, and he couldn't read, and he couldn't write, and he didn't want to. And except when he was hungry, he was quite happy. His name was Tegumai Bopsalai, and that means man who does not put his foot forward in a hurry. But we, O best beloved, will call him Tegumai for short. And his wife's name was Teshumai Tewindro, and that means lady who asks very many questions. But we, O best beloved, will call her Teshumai for short. And his little girl's daughter name was Tafamai Metamalai, and that means small person without any manners who ought to be spanked. But I'm going to call her Taffy. And she was Tegumai Bopsalai's best beloved, and her own mummy's best beloved, and she was not spanked half as much as was good for her, and they were all three very happy. As soon as Taffy could run about, she went everywhere with her daddy Tegumai, and sometimes they would not come home to the cave till they were hungry, and then Teshumai to Windrow would say, "Where in the world have you two been to get so shocking dirty? Really, my Tegumai, you're no better than my Taffy." Now attend and listen. One day, Tegumai Bopsalai went down through the beaver swamp to the Wagai River to spear carpfish for dinner, and Taffy went too. Tegumai's spear was made of wood with shark's teeth at the end, and before he had caught any fish at all, he accidentally broke it clean across by jabbing it down too hard on the bottom of the river. They were miles and miles from home. Of course they had their lunch with them in a little bag, and Tegumai had forgotten to bring any extra spears. "Here's a pretty kettle of fish," said Tegumai. "It will take me half the day to mend this." "There's your big black spear at home," said Taffy. "Let me run back to the cave and ask Mummy to give it to me." "It's too far for your little fat legs," said Tegumai. "Besides, you might fall into the beaver swamp and be drowned. You must make the best of a bad job." He sat down and took out a little leather mendy bag full of reindeer sinews and straps of leather and lumps of beeswax and resin, and began to mend the spear. Taffy sat down too, with her toes in the water and her chin in her hand, and thought very hard. Then she said, "I say, Daddy, it's an awful nuisance that you and I don't know how to write, isn't it? If we did, we could send a message for the new spear." "Taffy," said Tegumai, "how often have I told you not to use slang? Awful isn't a pretty word, but it could be a convenience now you mention it, if we could write home." Just then a stranger man came along the river, but he belonged to a far tribe, the Tawaras, and he did not understand one word of Tegumai's language. He stood on the bank and smiled at Taffy, because he had a little girl-daughter of his own at home. Tegumai drew a hank of deer sinews from his mendy bag and began to mend the spear. "Come here," said Taffy, like a good little colonial girl. And she stamped her foot, because she saw a shoal of very big carp going up the river just when her daddy couldn't use his spear. "Don't bother grown-ups," said Tegumai, so busy with his spear mending that he did not turn round. "I aren't," said Taffy. "I only want him to do what I want him to do, and he won't understand." "Then don't bother me," said Tegumai, and he went on pulling and straining at the deer sinews with his mouth full of loose ends. The stranger man, a genuine Tawara he was, sat down on the grass, and Taffy showed him what her daddy was doing. The stranger man thought, "This is a very wonderful child. She stamps her foot at me, and she makes faces. She must be the daughter of that noble chief who is so great that he won't take any notice of me." So he smiled more politely than ever. "Now," said Taffy, "I want you to go to my mummy because your legs are longer than mine, and you won't fall in the beaver swamp, and ask for Daddy's other spear, the one with the black handle that hangs over the fireplace." The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, thought, "This is a very wonderful child. She waves her arms and she shouts at me, but I don't understand a word of what she says. But if I don't do what she wants, I greatly fear that that haughty chief, man who turns his back on callers, will be angry." He got up and twisted a big flat piece of bark off a birch tree and gave it to Taffy. He did this, best beloved, to show that his heart was as white as the birch bark and that he meant no harm. But Taffy didn't quite understand. "Oh," said she, "now I see. You want my mummy's living address? Of course I can't write, but I can draw pictures if I've got anything sharp to scratch with. Please lend me the shark's tooth off your necklace." The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, didn't say anything. So Taffy put up her little hand and pulled the beautiful bead and seed and shark tooth necklace around his neck. The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, thought, "This is a very, very wonderful child. The shark's tooth on my necklace is a magic shark's tooth, and I was always told that if anybody touched it without my leave, they would immediately swell up or burst. But this child doesn't swell up or burst, and that important chief, man who attends strictly to his business, who has not yet taken any notice of me at all, doesn't seem to be afraid that she will swell up or burst. I had better be more polite." So he gave Taffy the shark's tooth, and she lay down flat on her tummy with her legs in the air, like some people on the drawing-room floor when they want to draw pictures, and she said, "Now I'll draw you some beautiful pictures. You can look over my shoulder, but you mustn't jiggle. First I'll draw Daddy fishing. It isn't very like him, but Mummy will know, because I've drawn his spear all broken. Well, now I'll draw the other spear that he wants, the black-handled spear. It looks as if it was sticking in Daddy's back, but that's because the shark's tooth slipped, and this piece of bark wasn't big enough. That's the spear I want you to fetch, so I'll draw a picture of me, myself, explaining it to you. My hair doesn't stand up like I've drawn, but it's easier to draw that way. Now I'll draw you. I think you're very nice, really, but I can't make you pretty in the picture, so you must be offended. Are you offended?" The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, smiled. He thought, "There must be a big battle going to be fought somewhere, and this extraordinary child, who takes my magic shark's tooth, but who does not swell up or burst, is telling me to call the great chief's tribe to help him. He is a great chief, or he would have noticed me." "Look," said Taffy, drawing very hard and rather scratchily. "Now I've drawn you, and I've put the spear that Daddy wants into your hand, just to remind you that you're to bring it. Now I'll show you how to find my mummy's living address. You go along till you come to 2 trees. Those are the trees. And then you go over a hill. That's a hill. And then you come into the beaver swamp, all full of beavers. I haven't put all the beavers because I can't draw beavers, but I've drawn their heads. And that's all you'll see of them when you cross the swamp. Mind you, don't fall in. Then our cave is just beyond the beaver swamp. It isn't as high as the hills, really, but I can't draw things very small. That's my mummy outside. She's beautiful. She's the most beautifulest mummy there ever was, but she won't be offended when she sees I've drawn her so plain. She'll be pleased with me because I can draw. Now, in case you forget, I've drawn the spear that Daddy wants outside our cave. It's inside, really, but you show the picture to my mummy and she'll give it to you. I've made her holding up her hands because I know she'll be so pleased to see you. Isn't it a beautiful picture? And do you quite understand, or shall I explain again?" The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, looked at the picture and nodded very hard. He said to himself, "If I do not fetch this great chief's tribe to help him, he will be slain by his enemies who are coming up on all sides with spears. Now I see why the great chief pretended not to notice me. He feared that his enemies were hiding in the bushes and would see him. Therefore he turned to me his back and let the wise and wonderful child draw the terrible picture showing me his difficulties. I will away and get help for him from his tribe." He did not even ask Taffy the road, but raced off into the bushes like the wind, with the birch bark in his hand, and Taffy sat down most pleased. Now this is the picture that Taffy had drawn for him. "What have you been doing, Taffy?" said Tegemai. He had mended his spear and was carefully waving it to and fro. It's a little arrangement of my own, Daddy dear, said Taffy, and if you won't ask me questions, you'll know about it in a little time, and you'll be surprised. You don't know how surprised you'll be, Daddy. Promise you'll be surprised. Very well, said Tigger-my, and went on fishing. The stranger man. Did you know he was a Tawara? Yes, Rudyard Kipling, we know. Hurried away with the picture, and ran for some miles, till quite by accident he found Teshimai Tewindro at the door of her cave, talking to some other Neolithic ladies who had come in to a primitive lunch. Taffy was very like Teshimai, especially about the upper part of the face and the eyes, so the stranger man, always a pure Tawara, smiled politely and handed Teshimai the birch bark. He had run hard, so that he panted, and his legs were scratched with brambles, but he still tried to be polite. As soon as Teshimai saw the picture, she screamed like anything, and flew at the stranger man. The other Neolithic ladies knocked him down and sat on him in a long line of 6, while Teshimai pulled his hair. It is as plain as the nose on this stranger man's face, she said. He has stuck my Tigger-my all full of spears, and frightened poor Taffy so that her hair stands on end, and not content with that, he brings me a horrid picture of how it was done. Look! She showed the picture to all of the Neolithic ladies, sitting patiently on the stranger man. Here is my Tigger-my with his arm broken. Here is a spear sticking into his back. Here is a man with a spear ready to throw. Here is another man throwing a spear from a cave. And here is a whole pack of people. They were Taffy's beavers, really, but they did look rather like people. Coming up behind Tigger-my, isn't it shocking? Most shocking, said the Neolithic ladies, and they filled the stranger man's hair with mud, at which he was surprised, and they beat up the reverberating tribal drums, and called together all the chiefs of the tribe of Tigger-my, with their hetmans and dolmans, neguses, woons, and acoons of the organization, in addition to the warlocks, angercocks, choo-choo men, bonzos, and the rest, who decided that before they chopped the stranger man's head off, he should instantly lead them down to the river and show them where he had hidden poor Taffy. By this time, the stranger man, in spite of being a Tawara, was really annoyed. They had filled his hair quite solid with mud, they had rolled him up and down on knobbly pebbles, they had sat upon him in a long line of 6, they had thumped him and bumped him till he could hardly breathe, and though he did not understand their language, he was almost sure that the names the Neolithic ladies had called him were not ladylike. However, he said nothing till all the tribe of Tigger-my were assembled, and then he led them back to the bank of the Wagai River, and there they found Taffy making daisy chains, and Tigger-my carefully spearing small carp with his mended spear. Well, you have been quick, said Taffy, but why did you bring so many people? Daddy dear, this is my surprise. Are you surprised, Daddy? Very, said Tigger-my, but it has ruined all of my fishing for the day. Why, the whole dear, clean, nice, quiet tribe is here, Taffy. And so they were. First of all walked Teshimai Tewindro and the Neolithic ladies, tightly holding on to the stranger man, whose hair was full of mud, although he was a Tawara. Behind them came the head chief, the vice chief, the deputy and assistant chiefs, all armed to the upper teeth, the hetmans and heads of hundreds, platoffs with their platoons, and dolmans with their detachments, woons, neguses, and acoons ranking in the rear, still armed to the teeth. Behind them was the tribe in hierarchical order, from owners of 4 caves, 1 for each season, a private reindeer run, and 2 salmon leaps, to feudal and prognathous villains, sending me entitled to half a bearskin of winter nights, 7 yards from the fire, and adscript serfs, holding the reversion of a scraped marrow bone under Harriet. Aren't those beautiful words, best beloved? They were all there, prancing and shouting, and they frightened every fish for 20 miles, and Tigger-my thanked them in a fluid Neolithic oration. Then Teshimai Tewindro ran down and kissed and hugged Taffy very much indeed, but the head chief of the tribe of Tigger-my took Tigger-my by the top-knot feathers and shook him severely. Explain, 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 cried all the tribe of Tigger-my. Goodness sakes alive, said Tegemai. Let go of my top-knot. Can't a man break his carp spear without the whole countryside descending on him? You're a very interfering people. I don't believe you've brought my daddy's black-handled spear after all, said Taffy. And what are you doing to my nice stranger man? They were thumping him by 2s and 3s and 10s, till his eyes turned round and round. He could only gasp and point at Taffy. Where are the bad people who speared you, my darling? Said Teshamai to Windrow. There weren't any, said Tegemai. My only visitor this morning was the poor fellow that you are trying to choke. Aren't you well, or are you ill, O tribe of Tegemai? He came with a horrible picture, said the head chief. A picture that showed you were full of spears. Perhaps I better explain that I gave him the picture, said Taffy, but she did not feel quite comfy. You, said the tribe of Tegemai altogether, small person with no manners who ought to be spanked. You? Taffy dear, I'm afraid we're in for a little trouble, said her daddy, and put his arm around her, so she didn't care. Explain, 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 said the head chief of the tribe of Tegemai, and he hopped on one foot. I wanted the stranger man to fetch Daddy's spear, so I drawed it, said Taffy. There wasn't lots of spears. There was only one spear. I drawed it 3 times to make sure. I couldn't help it looking as if it stuck into Daddy's head. There wasn't room on the birch bark, and those things that Mummy called bad people are my beavers. I drawed them to show him the way through the swamp, and I drawed Mummy at the mouth of the cave looking pleased, because he's a nice stranger man, and I think you are just the stupidest people in the world, said Taffy. He is a very nice man. Why have you filled his hair with mud? Wash him. Nobody said anything at all for a long time, till the head chief laughed. Then the stranger man, who was at least a Tuara, laughed. And then Tegemai laughed till he fell down flat on the bank. Then all the tribe laughed more and worse and louder. The only people who did not laugh were Teshamai to Windrow and all the Neolithic ladies. They were very polite to all of their husbands, and said, "Idiot," ever so often. Then the head chief of the tribe of Tegemai cried and said and sang, "Oh, small person without any manners who ought to be spanked, you've hit upon a great invention." I didn't intend to. I only wanted Daddy's black spear, said Taffy. Never mind. It is a great invention, and some day men will call it writing. At present it is only pictures, and as we have seen today, pictures are not always properly understood. But a time will come, O babe of Tegemai, when we shall make letters, all 26 of them, and when we shall be able to read as well as to write, and then we shall always say exactly what we mean without any mistakes. Let the Neolithic ladies wash the mud out of the stranger's hair. I shall be glad of that, said Taffy, because after all, though you've brought every single other spear in the tribe of Tegemai, you've forgotten my daddy's black-handed spear. Then the head chief cried and said and sang, Taffy dear, the next time you write a picture letter, you better send a man who can talk our language with it, to explain what it means. I don't mind it myself, because I am a head chief, but it's very bad for the rest of the tribe of Tegemai, and as you can see, it surprises the stranger. Then they adopted the stranger man, a genuine Tuara of Tuwa, into the tribe of Tegemai, because he was a gentleman and did not make a fuss about the mud that the Neolithic ladies had put into his hair. But from that day to this, and I suppose it's all Taffy's fault, very few little girls have ever liked learning to read or write. Most of them prefer to draw pictures and play about with their daddies, just like Taffy. Oh, wow, Kipling. Coming in clutch at the end. Yikes. Anyway, there's still a poem, and here it goes. There runs a road by Merrow Down, a grassy track today it is, an hour out of Guildford town, above the river way it is. Here when they heard the horse bells ring, the ancient Britons dressed and rode, to watch the dark Phoenicians bring their goods along the western road. And here or hereabouts they met, to hold their racial talks and such, to barter beads for Whitby jet, and tin for gay shell talks and such. But long and long before that time, when bison used to roam on it, did Taffy and her daddy climb that down and had their home on it. Then beavers built in Broadstone Brook, and made a swamp where Bramley stands, and bears from Share would come and look for Taffy where Shamley stands. The way that Taffy called Wagai was more than 6 times bigger then, and all the tribes of Tegami, they cut a noble figure then. I'm so happy I can read and write so that I can read these stories.